is open, micro ouvert.
It's up.
You will. I will. Okay. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Je suis honoré d'être ici aujourd'hui comme le directeur de la Fondation Konrad Adenauer. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As the director of Konrad Adenauer Foundation, I greet and welcome you for the launch of our CAS for Security grant publication. It's called Disinformation in the Transatlantic Arctic, Indigenous Partnership and National Readiness in Canada and Sweden. First of all, I would like to underline the importance of Arctic as a geopolitical and strategic region of interest in concern to security and defense, for instance, defending the Nordic flank of NATO, as a region of interest in concern to resources of critical minerals and production of industry, or as a strategic sea route for international transport, and last but not least, the Angle region of climate change and the homeland of indigenous people over centuries. This region is hosting different countries, not only Canada, but also Russia, and the European Union countries such as Sweden and Denmark. Information, disinformation and transparency in this region is important as the current digital age's challenges. As the report underlines, tackling hybrid warfare, or which information warfare is an integral part, is a whole of society and a whole of governments plural intended effort. That entails knowledge of regional specifics and how to mobilize at local, at regional, at national and at international levels. They and their populations can learn from each other and from one another. This is why in this report we compare and assess the importance of misinformation and disinformation between different indigenous communities in Canada and in Sweden, and showcase although countries through Arctic differ in their languages, history and politics face different economic and infrastructure challenges and relate to the environment in distinct ways. The threats of foreign malign influence and of political interference are common ones. As the report suggests, the Canada-Sweden examples identify potential starting points to productive pathways for building security in the Arctic through fostering civilian readiness and resilience of northern populations through activating the unique attributes of indigenous and the northern governance, society, and knowledge in national security policy. These lessons and directions will have application to other Arctic countries and will be important for non-regional countries in NATO and elsewhere, so that they better understand how to engage their Arctic allies better on issues related to the region. The authors assess that in an era of hostile state activities carried out below the threshold of open conventional warfare, the detection of activities such as disinformation, cyber intrusions, sabotage, espionage, getting the multiple levels of government and all sectors of society working together is essential. From Swedish side, we understand once more that the Arctic is entering a period of increasing geopolitical attention and competition. Security in the region is not only about military presence, but also about resilient communities, trusted information, and this is also includes local communities which play an important role in the situational awareness, resilience and crisis preparedness in the Arctic. The recommendations made in this report are highly critical. It is detected that misinformation is widely detected, disinformation is suspected but more difficult to confirm and attribute in the region. It is suggested that information integrity is in an area that will require more work by the Arctic 7 and their allies. To that end, the remaining recommendation is to dedicate a distinct line of effort to information security, tackling foreign information and misinformation within a larger effort to tackle hostile hybrid operations in Arctic settings as part of Canada's proposed Arctic Security Dialogue. Once more, it is important to understand the strengthening Arctic security requires closer cooperation with Canadian Indigenous as well as Sami institutions and northern communities, as well as stronger information resilience. We understand that northern communities are often small and tightly connected, forming what researchers are often call micromedia systems. This can make them particularly sensitive to misinformation and manipulation. I do remember the sentence, "Nothing about us without us." Konrad Adenauer Foundation would like to underline that security in the Arctic ultimately depends on strong partnership with the people who live in the region. Before I will leave now the floor to Mr. Alex Dalziel, I would like to say a big thank you to the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute and the Center for Information Integrity and all the authors, DL, Henrik Häggström and Camilla Unsgaard, as well as the Swedish Defence University Center for Total Defence and Societal Security for the research. Thank you very much, and I hand over now to DL.
Good morning. As mentioned, I'm Alex Dalziel. I'm very pleased to have had the opportunity to be one of the contributing authors to this report through the Centre for Information Integrity at the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute, and a very large thank you to Dr. Althusmann for the support from the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. I'm one of the contributing authors. As mentioned, the other two are researchers at the Centre for Societal Security at the Swedish Defence University in Stockholm, Henrik Häggström and Camilla Unsgaard, and I will have some remarks from them as well for this conference. So last week, the Prime Minister's office and the government announced billions in new spending in investments for infrastructure in the Canadian North. These are going to push Canada further and further into the geopolitical spotlight as one of the leading Arctic countries. At the same time, we have the dynamic of Sweden having joined NATO since the invasion of Ukraine and becoming one of its most active members. In this context of defense and security, and as Dr. Althusmann meant, hybrid threats, we face the particular challenge of disinformation, information designed to mislead, confuse, distract, and ultimately to advance the goals of other countries, covertly in some cases, and as part of larger campaigns of influence. It is part of the hybrid warfare Dr. Althusmann mentioned that extends from things like sabotage and economic coercion to this area of information manipulation, of which disinformation and misinformation are parts. To be clear, disinformation has intent, misinformation is rampant, not necessarily malignly intended, but having those effects. In this environment, we face serious geopolitical challenges. One is Russia, with its serious strategic intent to develop its Arctic and to establish itself as the gateway to the region, which deploys what it calls information confrontation as a strategy to compete with other countries, discredit them, and advance its own interests. We have the growing interest of China in the region, which is growing in sophistication, attention, and resourcing. And it has an information doctrine as well, speaking about the confrontation of systems, primarily rivalry between China and the United States, but within which influence and interference are components. We also have dissonance in the relationships among the Arctic countries, particularly over recent statements in the last year and a bit from the U.S. presidential administration, creating a certain dissonance over the issue of Greenland and creating challenges for the seven Arctic democracies of the region. Amidst that, Canada and Sweden are looking to advance their relations. We now have a partnership agreement between the two countries. And in the language that they've agreed upon, this recognizes disinformation as one of the shared threats. Meeting with the leaders of the Nordic countries on this weekend, that commitment to tackling hybrid warfare and building resilience was again spoken about by the Prime Minister and his Nordic colleagues. And this need applies to the security of information, its content, and its infrastructures. It's important to keep in mind that the Transatlantic Arctic, the Arctic of the European North and the Arctic of Canada's North, is not just a NATO Arctic, but it's an indigenous Arctic, as Dr. Althusmann mentioned. It is the homelands for people who have lived there from time immemorial. And one of the common findings of the report is that the problem of misinformation is very widespread, often from, sadly, domestic sources, from continental sources, often non-state, and elsewhere. In Canada's north, the territories, the homelands of Inuit Nunangat, the First Nations Dene, and the Gwich'in homelands are among the areas affected by misinformation. Some of the findings in the report speak to the disparities of access to reliable information that particularly affect northern communities and Indigenous communities. The fundamental issue raised repeatedly by Indigenous leaders about infrastructure disparities between the North and the South that limit access to reliable data or otherwise in the North. Social media plays a very important part of life in the North, but there is also a high volume of toxic information that has disproportionate impacts due to the micro information settings that have been very eloquently described by Danish researchers and Greenlandic researchers in their context. There's also noting in the North a growing strategic interest in the region, whether it's polarizing disinformation from within Canada and the United States, the awareness of a growing Chinese interest in the region's natural resources, and Russia's generally provocative behavior in the North. So this speaks to some of the dynamics in Canada. In the Swedish context, we're speaking about Sapmi, which is the homeland of Europe's only recognized Indigenous people, the Sami. It extends across Finland, Sweden, and Norway, and it is also noted there by Hagström and Unsgaard that the Arctic is entering a period of increasing geopolitical attention and competition, and security in the Swedish North is not only about information, military presence, but about resilient communities and trusted information. Local communities in Sapmi play an important role in situational awareness, resilience, and crisis preparedness in the Arctic. Emerging challenges include Arctic societies that are increasingly exposed to hybrid threats, including disinformation and foreign influence. These activities often occur below the threshold of open conflict. Information vulnerabilities are the small and tightly connected communities, the micromedia systems that I mentioned that Danish and Greenlandic researchers have talked about, and this can make them particularly sensitive to misinformation and disinformation. The priority in the Swedish North is strengthening Arctic security through closer cooperation through Sami institutions and northern communities, as well as stronger information resilience. So what are some of the solutions that we advocate? One is that we do need to look at the North as having its own sources of resilience. Indigenous government, in the case of Canada, and the multi-jurisdictional nature of our governance system is an asset for strengthening information flows. It's a crucial element of our political security, but also a way to organize ourselves. And the tight-knit Indigenous and Northern communities with modern treaties, in the case of Canada, Sami parliaments, in the case of Sweden, do provide also sources of strength and resilience, and are assets, not just vulnerabilities, to how we tackle this problem. As Prime Minister Carney said with his Norwegian counterpart last week, Arctic security is national security. And so to do that, we need a national effort that's bottom-up and top-down. To have access and knowledge through Indigenous partnership with Indigenous to the information environment that they're facing, wedded with the federal level intelligence and diplomatic and law enforcement capabilities that can attribute and, if necessary, prosecute such crimes. Academia, civil society, and the business community also have important roles here. Again, we need whole of society and we need all levels of government. Canada and Sweden have comparative advantages. Canada is a leader in talking about how Indigenous peoples can strengthen and contribute to foreign policy and defense strategy. Sweden and the other Nordic countries have advanced concepts of total defense or comprehensive security that involve military and society in preparing for war and emergencies. We both have something to offer the other. And it is crucial that in doing that we have the Indigenous peoples and their representatives at the table for those discussions. That could be in the form of the Arctic Security Dialogue that Canada has recommended that could replicate some of the strengths of the Arctic Council in having both state and Indigenous representation. Thank you for your attention, and I welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you. We don't have any questions at the moment. Nous n'avons pas de questions pour le moment. This concludes the press conference. C'est ce qui met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.
Merci.